So this is the May 14th, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. Welcome, everybody. We've got an agenda with some of our typical items, and then the bulk of our meeting we're going to spend hearing from Rise and Climate Action on the work that they're doing in support of the council's efforts, and hopefully provide us some real guidance on how we can make our work more equitable, inclusive, and so on. So looking forward to that conversation. Before we go there, we just got a couple quick things to do. Approve our agenda and approve our minutes from the last meeting. So any comments, revisions on either the agenda or the minutes from last week? Okay, I think we can take those as approved. I'm going to abstain since I was not present at the last meeting. So with that, I don't know, Jane, do you want me to kick it to you to kind of introduce our guests?
Sure, thank you. Morning, everybody. It is spectacular outside, so hope you all can find time to enjoy the day. I appreciate you all making the time to invite in Climate Access and Rise this morning. They will orient you all to the proposal that is in front of us for public engagement, which some of you have heard already, but we'll focus a bit on the phases that they propose doing, and then highlight and focus in on this first phase of engagement, and ask you all a series of questions to hopefully contribute as they think about reaching out and broadening the seat around the table with respect to considering audience analysis, interviews, and then roundtables around this first phase around framing the issues in order to ultimately inform your strategies and recommendation development. So not sure who wants to kick it off this morning, but there's a great team. So I'll turn it over to Sarika. Are you kicking us off this morning? Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Jane. Yeah, and Meredith, are you doing the screen share? There it is. Great. Thanks. Good morning, everybody. My name is Sarika Tandon, and I'm the principal of Rise Consulting, where we consult at the intersection of race, equity, and environmental issues. I'm also based here in Montpelier, Vermont. I'm here in partnership with Climate Access, who specializes in building support for climate solutions through innovative engagement projects and strategic consulting services. And I'm co-presenting today with Kara Pike, who's the Executive Director of Climate Access. And together with Meredith Herr, Deputy Director of Climate Access, we are developing and implementing the public outreach for the Global Warming Solutions Act Climate Action Plan. So we wanted to just start by sharing an overview of the work, outlining our approach, sharing the activities and timeline, and then having a conversation with you to make sure that we're including the voices that you think are important to be a part of the engagement process. So our approach really focuses on co-creation, which is taking a collaborative approach to innovating design and implementation. So we're thinking of co-creation with the Climate Council, with the subcommittees, including your subcommittee, through collaborative design and 3 touch points throughout the process, and with the Vermont public. So specifically with Vermont communities, we are looking to create a process that invites community members in and supports their ability to contribute to assessing risks and opportunities and determining strategies to prioritize. And we're hoping that our engagement builds buy-in for the plan, and that we're able to help support the plan in reflecting the priorities of the community and involving them in the process, not just of development, but hopefully of implementation as well. We're also centering principles of equitable engagement, which looks like engaging communities with respect, accessibility, and reciprocity. Being sure to engage communities that face disproportionate climate impacts in Vermont, including community expertise and voices from BIPOC, low income, youth, LGBTQ+, people with disabilities, and other communities that are often underrepresented in these kinds of planning processes. Offering underrepresented community members stipends for their time and participation, and just being responsive to the community and giving adequate lead time so that they can participate meaningfully. We're also offering multiple pathways for the community to engage, which includes storytelling, visual communications, community events and deliberative dialogues, and stakeholder surveys and interviews. And we're hoping that these methods will support people in engaging and contributing to prioritization and decision-making. And we're also hoping to go at the right pace, doing our best given the timelines that have been set out for us, which includes allowing time for outreach and input to avoid a process that only involves the usual suspects, avoiding harm to relationships with communities that have been historically underrepresented and are critical to engage, providing adequate time for community input to inform the draft, and avoiding checkbox community engagement, which is sort of the making it look like we talk to the community, but not really hearing what they're saying. So I'm going to turn it over to Kara to share the timeline and some of the benchmarks in the process.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us join your meeting this morning. And thank you, Sarika. So I'm just going to walk through the different stages of the engagement process. So this first phase is really around getting input on the development of the engagement plan itself. And so in addition to the meetings that we're doing with all of the subcommittees, meeting with Jane and the team, we're also going to be interviewing a number of stakeholders one-on-one, as well as holding two different roundtables, one for BIPOC leaders in particular, and then another that's broader. So we're really looking at what are the main sort of groups of stakeholders that we want to make sure we're engaging and talking to people who are from those communities, connected, working with those communities, who have insights on what will actually work best in terms of how we frame the issues and the ways that we're looking to engage people in the process. We'll also look at public opinion trends, what the media conversation, social media conversation has been like in Vermont, and come up with, in the beginning of the next phase, the engagement plan. So that's looking into now June. So when we go to this next phase, we want to really make sure that we're getting input before there is a plan. So what are people's concerns about climate risks? Given the range of solutions that you're considering, what strategies are most resonant with the public that would be considered for prioritization? So we're really going to kick off very actively the outward facing engagement process. Once we have that plan done, it will include creating a social media campaign, designing outreach materials, and then we'll actually announce the launch. This is happening. We want to hear from you, et cetera. There'll be an online survey that we create. We'll be developing web content about climate change and the plan, holding a number of stakeholder dialogues. Right now, this is planned for Zoom, but ideally, if we're getting into the summer months, we may be able to hold some in person. And then, part of why we want to start at the very beginning, reaching out to leaders who are already connected to or from different stakeholder groups, is really gain interest and buy-in from those leaders from the outset. So ideally, we can return to them and say, would you be willing to share this announcement that this process is kicking off? Would you be willing to co-host a dialogue with us, et cetera? So we'll be returning to those folks to see if they're willing to keep engaging with us through the process. So then we get into sharing out the draft plan itself and announcing the draft plan. There's a comment period. Again, that partner support will be doing more events, promoting it online, but also setting up an online deliberation and voting platform where people can really explore what's at risk, where the emissions coming from, as well as, what are the solutions in the plan, and weigh in. What do you think of this one? Which would you prioritize, et cetera? And then finally moving to the next phase where we're promoting the final plan. Again, returning to partners to ideally help us with that outreach, but doing press events, social, et cetera, to really make sure that Vermonters know here's the plan. But more importantly, here's your role in it. And that's a key part of what we want to communicate is here's what the state's doing as a whole, but here's where you fit into that. Per the 3 touch points that Sarika mentioned at the outset. So this is one at the beginning, making sure we're getting your input on who we should be engaging in the plan, your thoughts on the best way to do that. And then once we do have that pre-draft roll up of what we heard from the public, we'll be sharing that back with you as well. And then once there is that draft plan, once we've done the online deliberation, gotten more feedback, rolling that up and coming back and sharing that with you as well, so it can inform the final plan creation. So those are our stages, and then we'll be completing everything with an evaluation of how we did with the public engagement. So that's what we have in mind. And I'm gonna, before we do have a number of questions, we'd love to move into discussion, but before I do that, I'd just love to see if there are any questions. Looks like we're all set. Okay, great.
Charlie has a hand up, Carol.
Sorry, thank you. I was just wondering if, and maybe this is a subcommittee discussion more, but the timeline for the draft engagement process going from June to November, given the timeline that we're looking at for recommendations, seems problematic. If we all of a sudden get the results of this in November and it kind of throws all the work that's been done leading up to that in question, then we're left with like a month to get things together. So I just want to flag that as something that we need a deeper dive in to figure out, like, what work can we progress with in what way within that to make it functional. So thanks.
Yeah, and
I can speak to that too.
Sure, go ahead, Jen, please.
Well, you go first, and then I can follow up on the timeline.
Well, I was just going to say, if we're doing our job properly, we've gotten a lot of input early on. So rolling out the draft plan, which is, and Jane can speak to this timeline we have is December, that there will be time for public comment after that. In my experience, if we do it well, we've got enough input early on that by the time the draft, like by the time we get to that point, there won't necessarily be the same amount of engagement on that as in the earlier processes. But Jane.
Thanks. Charlie, on Monday, and if there's time, I'm happy to show it today to all of you, but we, at the steering committee meeting of the Climate Council, we looked at the timeline for the December 1st deliverable and thought about the key components of touch points with public engagement, recognizing that this first phase that you'll discuss in more detail now with these questions will come back to the subcommittees at the end of June to help you frame your strategies and recommendations with that input in mind, recognizing then that those that full suite of strategies and recommendations will go out for to test with the public and engage around over the summer, with the hope and expectation that that input will come back to you all in September, recognizing that there'll still be ongoing components, but that input on your strategies and recommendations will come back then. At the same time, you're sort of receiving the economic analysis back from the technical consultants. So at that point, you'll be able to refine your strategies and recommendations with the benefit of public engagement on them, as well as the economic analysis is the expectation and hope. And then be able to shift into sort of putting forward the cost and funding considerations, as well as the policy recommendations and the rules needed to adopt by ANR, which are all sort of the next components. And I want to talk more about all of that with you all either today or next week. I'm thinking about process documents, templates, deliverables with milestones and dates, planning out some of your meetings. But I just wanted to be mindful that you will have engagement back, and hopefully it'll come at the right time so it doesn't stall the work of the subcommittees. Lauren, go ahead if you want to follow up on that or ask a
one quick follow-up, Jane. If it's possible to get, just as a visual person, if it's possible to get that timeline in a visual document somehow, that would be super helpful.
I got it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah.
My question isn't on timeline, but it is on the process, if that's okay. So I've had the benefit of time since I heard Sarika and Meredith came to a different subcommittee that I'm liaisoning in. So I've had a bit of time to actually think of a good question. And because you brought up surveys, I wonder if there is any opportunity, because I think they're really good tools. One of the task conversations that's happening as kind of a subgroup of this subcommittee brought up the opportunity and utility of using surveys, especially for targeted outreach for like subject matter specific areas and not necessarily just like the full climate council level that you're looking at. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to co-create some of those with you all, or if that's something that you're considering when you say online surveys, if that's a useful tool for us that we can be using at the subcommittee and task level.
Yeah, thank you. So in our scope, we have just a general survey for the public, but part of why we want to have these conversations with each subcommittee is really identify what is the engagement that you need to be doing as a subcommittee, and how does that fit with the outreach that the other subcommittees are doing, and how do we coordinate that? And I do think there, when it comes to expert input, that's really your job, right? And we just want to make sure it's coordinated. So if you're talking to whatever group that and another subcommittee wants to do that as well, that we're just, we're connecting the dots that way. And then, really making sure when it comes to more public stakeholders that we're really thinking about how are we doing that in a way that isn't confusing to them, where they're getting asked different things by different subcommittees and it's not coordinated. So thinking that through. And absolutely targeted surveys can be really effective, especially if there is an organization or an association that is willing to run that, like share that survey with their membership. And so there could be different, agricultural land stakeholders that, there are good groups that you can reach a number of them through that we could consider contacting them to see if they'd be willing to do that. And we'd be absolutely happy to help draft those surveys.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So with that, as long as there aren't any other questions, we'd like to turn to you all for some questions now. So just a little bit about the process before we jump in. So we're having this conversation with all of the different subcommittees, and what we're trying to do is identify at a top level, what are the different types of stakeholders that need to be involved, both in your subcommittee process, but the climate action plan as a whole. And then are there particular organizations, leaders within that stakeholder group that we can identify who would be good to reach out to either, help inform the creation of the public engagement plan, or reach out to as one of those potential partners for helping us extend the engagement. And so we're having this conversation with each stakeholder group to ask you, like for your subcommittee, who do you think you need to reach? Who do you think needs to be reached for the plan as a whole? Who are, what are those organizations, individuals, et cetera, that are good entry points? And then we'll put all of this together into a spreadsheet so we can see each subcommittee identified these groups. Here's how they overlap and here's where they don't. And then come back with a list of who we think should be interviewed to inform the stakeholder engagement plan, as well as who we want to invite to those 2 roundtables that I mentioned earlier, the BIPOC specific roundtable and the broader leaders roundtable. And so we will be, after this meeting, putting everything together, sorting through it, and bringing that back to all of the subcommittees. We'll share that document with you so you can make comments. Have we missed anyone overall and who we're thinking about targeting? And then get you to weigh in on your opinion on who you think we should be interviewing and including in those roundtables. So that's our process for this, if that sounds okay to everyone. And I'll just jump in with the first question. That's all right? Okay. So I already mentioned it, so that it's really straightforward, just to hear from all of you what stakeholders need to be involved in your subcommittee work, and what do you hope to gain, what do you need or hope to gain from that engagement? And I think probably the easiest way to do it is I'll just pick someone to answer that. And then if that person could popcorn it to another person to also answer, that would be great. So Billy, I'm going to put you on the spot if that's okay, and hear from you first.
Sure, could you just restate the question if you wouldn't mind?
Sure, and I think Meredith put it in the chat as well. So what stakeholders need to be involved with your subcommittee work? And what do you hope or need to gain from that engagement?
I think largely it comes in two buckets from my perspective. For first, kind of stakeholders that have technical expertise and experience in the carbon sequestration and storage spaces, who have experience implementing different strategies, programs, and have that sort of technical depth to help us advise on the effectiveness of certain strategies that we're developing. And then I think another kind of focus area should be those who are most impacted by the strategies that we are considering, both in a positive and negative way, to see where opportunities are around co-benefits, opportunities to kind of move other public policy goals forward through investments in climate and carbon storage and sequestration, and then most importantly, to be aware and mindful of where we may be impacting people negatively, and adapting our strategies to avoid those sorts of impacts.
Okay, great. Do you want to popcorn it over to someone else now?
Sure. Alyssa, you're the first person I see.
Great. Thanks, Billy. Hi, Kara, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'll add to Billy's comments by saying I think the categories of stakeholders for me are first the land managers, especially for this subgroup. I think that's really important. And that includes both farmers and foresters as kind of our primary land managers. The next level of stakeholder group, I think, are the people that run the programs that are already supporting those land managers in making changes in how they manage the landscape. And there's a lot of people that are really good at understanding what kinds of outreach, funding tools and programs are already enabling change in the landscape. And I think they'll be really key to identifying which programs already exist and where the gaps in resources for making change are. And then the next piece I'll say is, I think Billy mentioned this a little bit, but scientific expertise and really understanding the effectiveness of strategies, and evaluating how the changes that we can potentially make are like what kind of impact they're going to have. And I think, Kara, I would just say, I think that this subcommittee has a really nice mix of all of those stakeholders already. So we could kind of look around and say, who's in this room, and then who are we representing? And you might get your list just from that, right?
Excellent. Okay, do you want to pass it to someone else, Alyssa?
Sure. I'll pass it to Judy. Good morning.
Good morning. So I think the most important stakeholders for me are the people that are negatively impacted. I think those that are positively impacted have a stronger voice and will speak out, but not necessarily the marginalized folks who are impacted. And I think I'd like to hear from other knowledge keepers, people who understand and use traditional ecological knowledge. And I'll pass it to Charlie.
Thanks, Judy. So I would agree with everything that's been mentioned so far. I think Alyssa kind of hit at where my brain tends to go automatically in terms of kind of those that are involved with kind of the working lands economy. So your primary production end mostly, so for farmers, supporting folks around that, foresters, but also thinking about, loggers, that area. where my brain goes with this is a little bit kind of to the next step in terms of how do we engage them though. And I just want to flag that, like, it's been my experience that farmers and people involved in the wood products industry are notoriously the hardest people to nail down because they're usually out the door at like 5 a.m. and don't get home until way after dark. And so, yeah, I hope we can carve out some time for ideas about how to reach them where they are. Another group that I would just put into a bigger bucket that we can tease out is rural communities and how we're going to reach those people in rural communities, given their impacts and also given their access. So like one thing that was mentioned was online voting platforms. How do we think about access to those things and how people can engage with them? So thanks. Let's see, John Roberts, I see you there, so I'll go to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlie. I think a lot I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think Charlie's point of meeting some of these smaller farmers, loggers, we may have to go to where they're at to get their voice. I think it might be useful to talk to some farmers who've implemented energy processing plants, methane digesters in particular, other things like that, people who are managing solar arrays with livestock to keep the vegetation down. No, I'm sort of, I don't really have much more to add to what's been said so far, but I do think we, in particular, we may have to really figure out ways to go to where the people are at to talk to them. And I will move this to David.
Thanks, John. Yeah, echo everything that's been said on that last point. You know, some success that I've had in other contexts has been is in fact going to the smaller rural communities to meet with folks. You know, ideally you can meet in someone's, you know, if you can find someone who's only volunteer to meet in their living room and have them invite folks. And the other thought is that not having it be wide open, that is smaller groups of people that are of like mind or like backgrounds. You know, a group of farmers, for instance, you know, is a much better get much better input meeting with them as a group than you do with having a meeting with them, with me, for instance, from Audubon, Vermont in the room. The other thought that I had is that there's the impacts of our recommendations are going to go beyond the forest and farm communities to the whole rural economy. You know, in these communities, the local feed dealers, the local hardware stores are all affected by this. So I think talking to the local chambers. And then likewise, the employees are not just, I mean, we should absolutely, of course, be talking to the farm workers, and particularly the migrant farm workers who are so often not heard. But there's, in a lot of communities, that is not the bulk of the folks working on farms or working on farm related stuff. So I think, I'm not sure the best way to reach those folks, but I think going to those communities and to some of those employers, the local hardware store, you know, get a few pizzas ordered and see who shows up. Then the only other thought I had was the hunting angling community. They have a super strong interest in this and are often ignored when we talk about environmental work, but they in fact are some of the strongest advocates and the most knowledgeable about the ways that the impacts are happening. So I'll shut up there. Thanks.
And do you want to pass it to someone, David?
Yeah, Jake, have you gone?
No, thanks. Yeah, sort of picking up on the theme that David was ending there with the impacts beyond land managers. We have, you know, a task of looking at food security and kind of broader impacts on the food system. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of both entities in the food system that work on food security issues, you know, the charitable food system, and also, those that they serve is another kind of base of getting, input from, and in terms of like marginalized communities and negative impacts, there's a lot to be said about that. And yeah, I think just thinking everything that everyone else has said, I think, there's an element of kind of the diversity within all of these stakeholder groups. So if we're looking at land managers, farmers, you do have new Americans, BIPOC that are kind of oftentimes not voices that do get captured when those groups are talked with. So, that I think is another important component, and I think this group has a lot of probably suggestions that we could offer for outlets for that. So those are the, I think the two big ones. And I think in terms of the food system broadly, there's just a lot of organizations that may not be working directly with farms, but do a lot around food systems that would be good to engage with, and that is a group to the Farm to Plate Network that I can actually might be an outlet for you to engage with. So I can definitely help in that space too. I will go to Lauren.
The benefit of being one of the last ones is that so many of the good ideas have already been captured. So I'll be brief and say I would add community watershed groups to our list of groups that we should be working with. I think, Alyssa, I really liked your capturing of like the different buckets of people, land managers, program managers. I would just specifically call out the current regulators, a lot of these programs that we're bringing them into. And I also would just flag that as we reach out to these groups and work with them, that we're also considering them implemented, like they're implementers of the work that we're going to be recommending. So keeping them on our list as like partner organizations, partner groups and individuals who are going to need to be lifted and supported throughout this process and beyond. And I think Ryan has not gone yet. Ryan, have you gone?
Oh, not yet, but I can speak to how much I agree with what's been shared to this point. I would add an underline to the agency's experience when promulgating new standards or approaches to environmental management, that direct engagement and sustained engagement and responding to feedback from those that are going to be impacted by the programs or are targeted to be impacted, to get specific feedback about gaps or opportunities or reasonableness is very important to ensure recommendations are going to be effective. In the other space that would speak to is our federal partners that provide much of the funding for programs, to understand how their existing programs could support this implementation work on the state level, and also opportunities to help refine or expand eligibility for some of their dollars, as they're some of the largest funders for land management implementation in the state. And so make sure they're called out explicitly. And I see the agency's role as interfacing with those partners, as well as the other partnership network of implementers and other water quality or nonprofit organizations that work in that space. And Abby, I think you're, unless I miss you, you might bring us home.
Let's see. Obviously, I agree with all that's been shared. I have some sort of probably what's going to seem like strange suggestions, but I think a part of our stakeholders are real estate agents and developers. They are currently literally on the front lines of the massive land transfer and land use piece that's taking place, which is an enormous component of everything that we're needing to do if we don't have the ability to access land base to keep it to build climate resilience, this isn't going to work. And they're the people that are literally making those transitions happen. So I think it would be really interesting to hear from them to see what their take is as to what they're seeing from new landowners, for example, that are coming in, what their attitudes are about this type of work, and how they see themselves playing a part in this future. Vermont Relief Collective is a specific organization I would call out, which Sarika, I'm sure you're on top of. And I guess as a person who lives essentially in Massachusetts, I would like to really articulate that it is not only imperative that we be going to every county in the state, but that in doing so, you are identifying the people who can bring the critical mass of the stakeholder, of the communities that you need to engage in, not basing that on somebody's idea from up here as to who that is, because I can nearly guarantee you that that's not who it is. And Bennington County, for example, has been pretty widely ignored in a lot of this process. They don't have anybody on the Climate Council from Bennington County. And so, there are a lot of land managers there and a pretty interesting farming community there, for example. And so reaching them is going to be critical, and bringing them along is going to be critical. And that's not being done as far as I can tell. So the geographical spread is necessary because there are lots of us doing this work in all different types of the state, and we're certainly not treated equitably in the process.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. I also just want to note that Iris has a comment in the chat. Her Wi-Fi isn't good, but it's an important comment about really making sure we're trying to identify the leaders within the land manager community and get their input. So thank you for that.
Oh, one more. Conservation districts is another great place.
Okay, great. Well,
Sorry.
thank you, everyone. And we want to move now to the next question. And it may be that you've covered a lot of what you would want to share, but stepping back a little bit from the specific work of this subcommittee, when you're thinking about the climate action plan as a whole, are there other key stakeholders that haven't been mentioned that we should be keeping in mind in the process? And maybe with that, I'll start with Judy, and then if you want to pass it to see if anyone else would like to join as well.
Other groups and communities, yeah. I'm thinking of people who use non-timber forest products for a living. Myself included. I'm a basket maker, so I harvest on my materials. Pass it to Abby.
Uh-oh, now I gotta think quick. What sectors, groups, communities need to be engaged? I have no answer at this time. May I ruminate for a little bit
Or you
longer?
can pass to someone else and we can always come back to you.
David, any ideas?
And it's okay if you feel like we've covered it, then you can always just add comments into the chat if there are others. I know I'm just looking at the clock too, and I know we have a public comment period. Billy, we'll go to you, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sarika for our last question for the group.
Thanks for bailing me out.
I did think of one thing I could say quick. I just want to reiterate that whoever said, I apologize, can't remember who said it, but ultimately, as far as the data is showing and things, right, a lot of this work has to be implemented by people. And so whoever it is, and a lot of the time that is the farmers and the farm workers. So migrant justice is obviously a critical component of this, but builders, et cetera, Charlie just brought that up. The people who are actually doing, the workers who are doing this work really, really need to be engaged, because I think they see cracks in codes or enforcement or regulations and things that obviously others don't. And so that's really going to show us where are the cracks that we already are working with and how can we improve those things moving forward.
Great. Alyssa.
Thanks. I just realized, what we've missed so far in this conversation is I think there's a large responsibility, conversation, and power going on in some of the large institutions in the state. University of Vermont gets a lot of pressure from students to engage in more climate action proactively. And I think there are a number of kind of like large employers or institutions that should be engaged because they have a lot of internal leverage. And I'm not sure the best way to do that, but I'm sure there's other corporations and, the state and IBM. There's probably folks that make decisions there, Ben and Jerry's, yeah, that we should include. Maybe you've already thought about this. That's all.
Keep the ideas coming. Thank you, Billy.
I think this is more of a question than a suggestion, and maybe something the steering committee or the council need to sort through, but it's to what extent we engage Vermont legislators in this process through the kind of public engagement work. I know, they've largely done their job, enacted the law and ceded the implementation to the council, but ultimately we're going to be likely needing to go back to them to authorize new spending and new laws, and how we keep them apprised of the directionality of our work, I think is a question maybe not for this phase of public outreach, but one we should continue to keep in mind.
Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. And I just wanted to go back to the point that was made about the importance of going to where people are at. And I completely agree with that. And it is part of our plan, obviously contingent on the ability to meet in person and all of those things, but we should be getting better on that by the summer. But I completely agree. And I think it is things like, is there a leader within a community who would be willing to host people in their living room for a dialogue, or, also going and tabling at community events is a great way. And this is where the survey piece comes, where you don't have it digitally, you have it on a piece of paper and you just talk to someone and fill it out. And so we really need to be thinking about going to where people are at, low tech options that, we have to consider technology access issues, internet access, broadband, all of that. And so I just wanted to make sure that everyone knows those are issues that we are thinking about. I'm going to turn it over to Sarika for the last question. And it's a little early out here on the West Coast and I have to get my kids off to school. So I'm going to leave it with my colleagues to wrap us out. But we really look forward to working with you, and we will be returning to you with the spreadsheets for your input and the interview and roundtable lists. But thank you all so much.
Thank you, Kara. So our last question is getting a little bit more specific, and to ask you for names of leaders. So when we're thinking about public stakeholders, are there community, business, youth, equity, Indigenous, local government, or other leaders who represent their communities and could be involved with outreach efforts to key constituents that we need to reach? So we're asking now for names, and you can feel free to come off mic, share names. You can add them to the chat, and we'll also be sharing a spreadsheet for people to see who's been suggested and to add to that after the meeting. So, and also if there's people that you, like Jake mentioned, the Farm to Plate Network, if there's people or groups that you can help be a bridge person for, we'd be happy to know that as well.
Can I just pause and ask a question here? So you're gonna capture names and then get the list back to us. I'm just concerned about whether we want to be a little bit more strategic about this, that within sectors or groups that we work with, whether there's additional coordination needed to kind of line up who the best representatives are, and not just kind of scattershot invitations out to a bunch of names. So that's just a kind of question I have that I'll kind of leave out there for the group.
Yeah, and so the list is a bit of a data dump at this point, and then we will be filtering that list through some lenses around regional diversity, the perspectives we want to make sure we're uplifting for the first phase of the audience analysis, and we will be vetting that with the Just Transition Subcommittee.
Okay, I guess that's fine. I'm just thinking that I feel like I'm not in the position to give you a comprehensive list of names right now. And I doubt everyone else is, and whether a task is for our group to kind of do that work and get back to you after this meeting. I think it's fine to surface some names now, but I would hope to think that's not our only opportunity to get you contacts.
Yeah, Billy, to echo what you shared within our ag agencies network and folks we work with and stakeholders, we could work to find a good list that could be vetted to see if it represents folks well. But I agree with taking a little bit of time to strategically identify some folks might be a good idea. Could get that probably next week, so it wouldn't take too long, but it may be a bit delayed for us to share those names.
Sure. Meredith, do you want to share about the process we have for collecting names? Or
Yeah, we have a spreadsheet that we've put together, and we can share that maybe through Jane, figure out the best way to coordinate if that Google Doc is the right way to do that, or if it's easier just for folks to individually email myself or Kara too. We can do that. However, it's kind of the most low tech and easy for folks to get involved. But yeah, definitely understand the need to kind of take a beat, sit back, think about who those right people may be, or checking with others to kind of help brainstorm those names too. And then we can help put that all together in a list. And I think it'll be helpful for the different subcommittees to then be able to look across and see what names have been brought up by other subcommittees too. And that may help kind of jog ideas as well and coordinate across that.
Good, thank you.
thank you to everyone who is sharing names in the chat as well. So I'm not sure how much time we have with you, or if you're moving into public comment soon.
Sorry, I'm just trying to find our agenda. I think we're probably around 11:05 going into public comment, but let me just confirm that.
Yep, that's what the agenda says.
Okay. So we've still got about 15 minutes.
So would anyone else like to share names verbally? Because if not, we can still use the chat and see the time.
Well, I'll just say the names that I don't know, and that I don't know that who the right people are to ask to get those names, other than starting to call to the Regional Planning Commission leadership. But I think if you called all the Regional Planning Commission leaders and said, who are the local business leaders in each by county or, key kind of key communities. But in the same way that it's hard to reach farmers and foresters and loggers, getting to anybody in the small business community is a challenge. And very few of us get to interact with them in these kind of settings because they're running their businesses. So we don't know. So I would think finding a strategy like talking to the regional planning commissions or what is the other group called? The regional
industrial development corporations.
The regional development corporations would be really good sources of information to connect with those folks.
Thanks for that, David.
Business leaders are not like the big corporate leaders. Like our business leaders are, the local bookstore owner, the person who runs a gas station, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, thank you for that. And specifically at this point, we're looking for people to invite to the 2 roundtables for community leaders, and also to do individual stakeholder interviews to come up with an audience analysis summary that distills input so that we can give that report to you within the next month and a half.
I'm typing as fast as I can.
Thank you,
It'll-
John.
It'll take a while.
So I think that might be it for our process. Those are all the questions we wanted to cover. And I appreciate all the names in the chat. Those can keep coming. And as we mentioned, we'll have that spreadsheet that we can share that we can continue to add into once you've had a time to think. But I think that was it for our piece. We wanted to be ahead of schedule. That's great. Thanks so much for being here, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And I know, Jane, you shared that kind of visual schedule of the kind of engagement flow and plan development. Is there anything that's more granular that shows the touch points that climate action and RISE, or climate access and RISE kind of spoke to earlier?
No, we have you guys. I'm not sure if you shared it in the presentation today, but there's a more detailed schedule that I know was shared when we met with the Public Service Department around coordination with the Comprehensive Energy Plan the other day, that shows the schedule for the engagement for the Climate Action Plan. I will say that in thinking forward, the work between ANR, myself, and Climate Access and RISE in the next week or two will be fleshing out sort of like refined schedule of like when that synthesized information. So when subcommittee should be planning to meet with the consultants again to inform the next phase of your work. And so it feels like the end of June will be one of those touch points to receive this initial synthesis of information. And then again, in end of August or September will be another critical touch point on receiving feedback for the strategies and recommendations. And so what that means will be, around the planning of your meeting agendas in the coming weeks to recognize that sort of at that same time, you'll also have to be hearing from all of the task leads on their full suite of strategies to put forward for the public engagement over the summer, so that Ag and Ecosystems has a cohesive package to put forward. And in addition to templates that you'll be feeding into for the strategies and recommendations, the other thing that I can speak to is that what I want to work on with Climate Access and RISE is for me to create a first draft of a slide deck, so we can think about how we consistently present that information this summer also to Vermonters around the strategies and recommendations, so that we're all feeding into the same system, so that it's not a bottleneck when we get all that information. So that's all important in the coming weeks, but it really does mean that you have about 6 weeks to put together a complete package of that first round of strategies that will be tested. So that doesn't mean, how are you going to fund it, the details of the programs, that's to be determined after, but it means by the end of June, we're looking at a full package of strategies and recommendations. And I'll just say for other subcommittees, like cross-sector is one in particular, we're actually, what that means is scheduling out the next few meetings to actually think about how you're going to hear presentations from all the task leads. And that decision-making for this point in time will be at the subcommittee level for what you want to test and package out. It won't need to be prioritized by the Climate Council. There just, to be frank, won't be time to do that. And so this will be the subcommittees putting forward your package for this round of public engagement.
Okay, great. Well, thank you to everyone who joined us today and presented, and for the work you've done so far, and all the work that we know is coming with public outreach. We really appreciate and need your assistance. So it's great that you're here. Any other comments, questions for the presenters or broadly on this topic before we move on? Lauren's got her hand up.
Yeah, it's a question for Jane on the timeline and what you just went over too. The timeline that you sent out to the chat at Charlie's request has the ongoing efforts. This is just a clarifying question. The second bullet is update climate action plan to address the 2030 and 2050 requirements. And I just want to make sure that as we're developing strategies, that the 2025 is going to be largely emissions reductions focused, and I get that, but because a lot of what the emissions reductions strategies might have significant impact to our land development and land use. I just want to flag that a lot of what we have to do to meet 2030 and 2050 with respect to carbon sequestration and storage especially is going to require making some things happen now to protect those areas and create space for that. So I don't know if that needs to be, I don't know if I'm saying that well, but I just want to make sure
I don't
that
understand your point on that one, Lauren. Could you
okay,
try
so
to?
an example.
Are you speaking to the sequestration and really resiliency work? Because that will be a component. Go ahead.
If cross-sector mitigation says that we need to expand X number of renewable energy locally sourced or sited throughout the state, that might have implications on where we put that. Will have implications potentially on our ag lands, our natural and working lands, which would then potentially have impacts to all of the things that this subcommittee is working on. And so I just want to make sure that that 2025, if that's going to happen before or by December, and that the things that we're working on aren't really being considered until after that, that there is some crosstalk that needs to happen, because there are implications to the work that would happen for emissions reductions on our land use work, which is what we're talking about here.
So I think I understand what you're saying, but maybe I'm still not getting it. I guess I hope, because we've had this conversation a little bit before around sort of the representation of the plan that gets put forward for December 1st. I think there's just a recognition that we need to highlight and where things need to be prioritized, not in ag and ecosystems and rural resilience, but where they need to be prioritized with respect to the cross-sector mitigation components of the plan. They need to prioritize a package that gets us to 2025. That's not irrespective of also the comprehensive nature of the plan that we'll put forward on December 1st, also speaking to sequestration, resiliency, all the other components that will be ready for December 1st, because we're not just putting forward an emissions reductions plan for December 1st. It's a comprehensive plan that will address strategies and recommendations across all the areas of work that are articulated in the statute. So I think that what I hope, and I apologize if this is how it gets represented, that's only to articulate that where and when we need to sort of cut the conversation short for December 1st, is that we need to really be prioritizing in that sector of work how we get to 2025, and that also that of course has impact and influences on the other areas of work that we're summing up for that plan as well. So I don't mean to, that it's just a necessary, I feel like, distinction to understand that that we have to have that package for 2025 in this plan, but we will also have the other components spoken to in the plan as well.
Yeah, and I think we just need to talk about, how far we go in doing those different elements. I think, Lauren's suggestion, as I understand it, is, we're in a position to put some sideboards or recommendations around where new generation gets sited on the landscape, given our focus on resilience and climate adaptation. So, obviously not all of that generation is going to get built in the next year. So the next 3 or 4 years. So I think we have time to refine those recommendations. There's opportunities through the comprehensive energy plan to refine the siting of those sorts of facilities, but we do need to talk about how we at least put some directional sideboards on that those new developments in the future through our work in the first plan.
I'm just gonna call something out here that I think is a tension point that we're dancing around, and I want to put this out there. I understand that the way that the law was written is that the emissions reductions have to get met or A&R gets sued. I get it. That's obviously, I personally think maybe that wasn't the best way to create a holistic process and a comprehensive climate plan. That doesn't matter. The law was written as the law was written. I think the point that Lauren is trying to get to, and what I can attest to having witnessed for years now, is in the attempt to pursue the short-term goal, we miss so much in terms of what we need to put in place to achieve our long-term goals. And around this table, you have here people who are directly and have been directly impacted by those decisions already, and who will be further impacted by them in the future. And the tension that's playing out in this subcommittee is the fact that I'm not willing to sign on to only thinking about what's going to make those emissions go down. I need to know that we can survive here and meet those goals for the future and provide for our people fully. And I am not feeling like I'm being met in good faith on that when we continue to articulate over and over the focus being on the emissions reduction. We miss so much when we just put that at the forefront. We can reduce emissions and also make all of those long-term goals possible. And I don't understand why we have to separate it out so specifically. I get it. I know it's a question of bandwidth. I know it's a question of resources and time and. But this keeps coming up, and I'm sorry, but I am not feeling like I am being heard in this. And that's really concerning. And I need to know that this process is going to result in something that's going to mean that my farm can exist here, whether the emissions are reduced or not. And if we're not talking about all that all at once, what is the point?
Not 100% how to respond, Abby. And
you don't have to. We can just let that sit. You don't need to respond to it. It's not your job to respond to that. I just think we need to call out the tensions for what they are and put them out there.
I guess I just want to test, so if those tensions are real or perceived, only because I think the intent, and I respect that the timeline presents a super hard challenge around that knitting together of the comprehensive nature of all the components that we're striving to speak to. And in that case, the only thing I can say is that that's not sort of on me or the agency to change. That's on House and Senate appointments to talk to your legislators who appointed you around the timeline, because that's where it has to change at this point. And so the nature of knitting it all together in a comprehensive fashion, perhaps one thing that I can do clearer is stop calling attention to the emissions reductions, even though, and as sort of that sort of focus in December 1st, because it's not our intent, my intent anyway, is not to ensure that everything is not speaking to each other and complementing each other. But one of the points you made, and I think Lauren made too really well, is, I do think like transportation is one that I know Joey Miller and Gina and I have talked about offline a number of times, is, the short-term emissions require us to have this heavy focus on electrification and like shifting the way we use vehicles. But the long-term vision really has to be around conservation, driving less, land use planning to enhance people's ability not to drive as much and all of that. And that just takes time. And by having those short-term intermediate steps of 2025 and 2030, we do need to ensure that we're not missing the bigger picture of how we get to a transformative environment that we do as we decarbonize. So I hear you. I support all of it, and I think the nature is that it's a ridiculously ambitious timeline.
Yeah,
I mean, this morning. Go ahead, Billy.
I was just the last thing I would say, kind of Abby's point, is that I don't think anyone is saying we can and shouldn't address these broader topics in the first plan. I think what I'm hearing is that we just have to address the emission reduction strategies because that's what we're statutorily bound to do. We have more flexibility in the other areas. If this group is ready to deliver comprehensive and in-depth strategy recommendations related to all the resilience and land use pieces for this first plan, then I think we absolutely can and should do that. But I don't think there's anything preventing us other than time and capacity. So that's how I look at it. It's not that we're putting that stuff aside. It's just an acknowledgement that there's a lot to do between now and then. And we have the kind of flexibility and opportunity to be more iterative in our work around resilience and adaptation. And we've got harder deadlines with some of the reductions work. So I see Ryan's hands up, and then we should probably get going to some public comment maybe after Ryan.
Sure, I'll be brief and just sharing. I hope that from my perspective, I think the work this subcommittee is undertaking is attempting to look at a comprehensive approach to making recommendations that meets the statutory requirement while ensuring we consider the broader context of agricultural and forest products economy and sustainability of those industries. I am also optimistic about how many of the practices or strategies that could be recommended can have multiple co-benefits, and we work in a space where we can try to make legible how practices that can have an impact on ag emissions also can benefit many of these other co-benefit and economic and environmental sustainability questions. So I'm optimistic, but do agree it's a very ambitious timeline and scope. But I think that we can work to still endeavor to address all of the questions before us.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Abby and Lauren, for raising this. I think the tension is real, and it's good to just nail it head on. And we can spend some more time either later today or future meetings kind of drilling into it. Because I think the last thing we want to do is for folks to feel like their priorities and their kind of voices are not being heard and not incorporated adequately in the planning effort. So we've got our first opportunity for public input or comment right now. Those of you from the public, anyone interested in speaking briefly right now, would you be willing to raise your hands through Zoom or otherwise identify yourselves verbally? I see Jennifer. Anyone in addition to Jennifer?
Billy, this is Zach Porter. I cannot raise my hand because I'm on the phone, unfortunately, but I would like to make a comment.
Okay, I see.
Thanks.
And I see Graham's hand up as well. So why don't we go with Jennifer, Zach, and then Graham. So Jennifer, if you could take a couple minutes to address the committee.
Thanks, everyone. I'll start with a general comment, and that's inspired a little bit by what Abby was saying. I think of our agricultural lands and our forested lands as being key in terms of the soil and sequestering carbon. So that soil within the carbon, the soil within the plants and animals is enormously important and clearly have many co-benefits beyond that. But in terms of climate, in terms of carbon sequestration and storage, our agriculture and farm systems are critically important. And so I think sometimes that will get lost a little bit, when I'm thinking of renewable energies. I'm thinking of a wide variety of other things. So whatever we can do to support those, which means supporting the people who are there, as well, running those places, if you will. The other thing I wanted to mention is some what are probably considered smaller stakeholders. I'm thinking just for example, of Susu Community Farm here in southern Vermont. And on their website, it's Sowing Seeds of Liberation in Vermont, offering life-affirming spaces for BIPOC to thrive. And they focus on small farm systems. And then another one is New Farms for New Americans, working with immigrants. And I just think there would be such beauty in being able to better support entities like that, while at the same time instilling climate change notions into the conversation and having them be stakeholders at the table. The other thing I wanted to mention was small conservation organizations. More and more nonprofits have on their web pages carbon sequestration and storage as they conserve forested land. So I think having them in on the conversation as stakeholders. And I really agree with the notion that educational entities are important, the University of Vermont, other entities within the state as well. And Judy mentioned she passed some seeds along to Abby that can then be sow more seeds. And I think, you know, anything like that, anything non-timber forest products, all of those stakeholders should definitely be considered. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. Zach.
Thanks, Billy. And yeah, I appreciate the chance to weigh in here and at this point in the conversation. And it was a good discussion earlier. And again, this is Zach Porter. I'm the Lake Champlain Lake Keeper at Conservation Law Foundation. I wanted to just weigh in on a few things. One is to suggest, I don't think I heard public health as a category of stakeholders who should be included, public health professionals or others with input on, you know, as far as public health is concerned. But I'd really like to make sure that that's a component here as well. So, you know, doctors, researchers, et cetera. Another category that I think we've touched on, but I wanted to just name more explicitly is, you know, those Vermonters who, you know, really want to make sure that, you know, those without a voice have a seat at the table. And so those who are speaking to the intrinsic value of our natural ecosystems, of the, you know, wildlife, plants, et cetera, that we share this place with, that they have a seat at this table as well. So making sure that there's voice there. And then lastly, I wanted to speak to the kind of topic of public engagement. And I think something that I've shared with state agency staff on a few occasions over the last year, as far as public outreach is concerned during a pandemic, is, you know, and I hope that the council and the, you know, people drafting the engagement plan might consider is to not just think about, you know, different forms of technology to reach people, or, you know, necessarily trying to go out to find people, especially in this public health emergency that we're in right now. But to think about actually the times of day that we're offering opportunities for people to connect with us. I think that often is one of the greatest limiting factors for people who are just in the middle of their busy lives. And so ensuring that, you know, we have public comment opportunities or engagement opportunities, you know, that are, you know, not just in the middle of the day, but in the early mornings and the late evenings, you know, weekdays, maybe even weekends, but finding ways to create space for people who aren't paid to do this, you know, to or aren't retired or et cetera, have, you know, the ability to otherwise weigh in, to make sure that they've got a chance to engage. But yeah, thanks again, and appreciate all your good work.
Thanks, Zach. Graham. Please go ahead.
Thanks, folks. My reception is pretty in and out this morning, so you'll just be hearing me. Yeah, I appreciate the conversation. In terms of stakeholders, I also wanted to reiterate what was said around rural healthcare providers and also care providers in those communities. I think about childcare and elder care as well in rural communities, and having worked with some of those folks professionally, myself in various capacities over time, I think they see a lot of indicators about see a lot of different indicators of health in rural communities that would be important to look at in relationship to our work here. It makes me also think of like volunteer responders and first responders in communities as we're thinking about adaptation and resilience. I think like about some local sort of volunteer ecology groups that exist in communities, and this is just about sort of, again, targeted outreach in specific communities. For example, in this Plainfield Marshfield area, there's the Upper Winooski Valley Field Naturalists Association, I believe it's called, for example, and that's what a great group of people to reach out to speak to about this topic. I think about those representing employees. This is just sort of the larger climate council conversation, whether it's unions or member-based organizations. I think about schools. And I think there was a question also about who to invite to the table around how to build a stakeholder engagement process, although I know that you've already put out this timeline and some of your methodology here. And I know that there's an effort I believe it's called Rejoice, that's been working around Vermont a little bit. And I know Jennifer Byrne at the White River Natural Resource Conservation District has been a member of some of that work, and they might be helpful to look towards like grassroots engagement around a stakeholder process like this. And lastly, I just wanted to just speak to I think the importance of resolving some of what Abby was speaking to, and also what Lawrence has spoken to. I think some of the comments I've made here in the past are around some of the challenges of quantification, especially when it comes to this, what's called sequestration, and thinking about, when you have things like rural resiliency and adaptation, the intrinsic value of things as being really hard to quantify, but which clearly have a lot of qualitative value. How do we leverage that in a process, in this case, a law, which is specifically built around quantification and numbers? And I think, Jane, you said this is really about the people who wrote this law. And I think that, just as me being a policy director at a small nonprofit that does work with the legislature, just reminding folks that keep those lines of communication open with your representatives and otherwise, and be in touch with organizations like mine if we feel like it's important to have different types of conversations with them about how this is going, what could change, etc. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for your comments. Anyone else, members of the public, would like to speak briefly at this time? We do have another opportunity at the end of our meeting. Okay, great. Thanks for that, everyone. Moving on, we're a little bit behind schedule, but I think we can probably make up some time with these next few items. There was a VCC steering committee meeting earlier this week, I believe. So Jane, I don't know if you have any brief updates to share with this group on that meeting.
Sure. Just as a reminder that the steering committee now meets bi-weekly, with one of their meetings focused around convening the co-chairs of the subcommittees. So this was that meeting. It was really productive. David Plum and I sent out a series of questions that all the subcommittee co-chairs spoke to around identifying one or two areas of overlap that subcommittee co-chairs saw with their other subcommittee co-chair counterparts, as well as speaking to the ability to deliver that package of strategies by July if there was any expectation that wouldn't work for co-chairs. So it was really a great conversation between all the subcommittee co-chairs, as well as a brief conversation focused around that graphic I shared earlier, and thinking about all the components of public engagement and technical analyses, and when we'll know what, in order to ultimately inform the milestones that we all need to hit as subcommittees. So that was really it. Anybody else who was there is welcome to add any additions. So thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Anyone who attended, participated, or observed that meeting have any additional thoughts to share with this group? Okay. Thank you. Let's see. So now we come to our weekly installment of report outs from the task coordination groups and with our just transition liaison. So I can go first since I'm talking. For the forest and natural land sequestration and storage group, we finally got our full group gathered early this week. We set a standing meeting for every other week gatherings of that group. And I think had a good conversation about how we can now really dig into pulling together a broad suite of strategies in those spaces. We talked about, how and when we should kind of filter those strategies for equity and other considerations, and largely agreed that at this point, let's just cast a wide net, get everything we can into a spreadsheet, and then kind of narrow from there. So we've got another meeting in about a week and a half. I'll send some directions out to folks early next week around what the goals are, but really at this point, we're trying to pull together known and proposed ideas to maximize storage and sequestration, and then shape those into strategies, recommended strategies going forward. So I don't know if Judy, Charlie, David, do you have anything else you want to share from that? Okay, let's see. Abby, why don't you give us a report from your group?
We had a great kind of unstructured chat this week to check in on the spreadsheet that we've been working on, kind of trying to think about, furthering our conversation around stakeholder engagement and sort of these bigger picture ideas about what a sustainable food and forest economy looks like and how to incorporate that into the work ahead. But I'm happy to have anybody else jump in with any updates they want to add. Lauren or Charlie or Alyssa. We've sort of been doing a lot of our work in our Google Docs.
Great. Google Docs it is. Let's see, Ryan, you're the next person I see.
Sure. Billy. Sub-task group 5C. We had a meeting this week where we're beginning to dig into the directional rankings of a number of different practices and strategies for addressing ag emissions while trying to look at co-benefits. We're going to begin adding some categories looking at technical feasibility, equity, and cost of farmers to implement. And we'll be reconvening next week to dig into the question of folks pulling out some of their preferred strategies. And we'll be digging in a bit more to that question. And not sure if anyone else from the group would like to fill in something I may have forgotten.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Sounds like you all are making some good progress. Lauren.
Hey, can I just make an editorial comment, Billy?
Of course.
The reason we're making good progress, and I think we are, is really Ryan and his team, Judson and Alec, they're doing some really great work to help bring resources and information for us. So I just want to express public appreciation to that, so everyone can hear that.
Excellent. Thanks, David.
Thanks very much.
The nature-based solutions team is doing a lot of Google Doc work too. Whatever the past tense of forego is that I can't seem to think of right now, are meeting this week and are going to reconvene next week, so that we're kind of doing our individual work and reaching out to our respective peer and professional networks to kind of get some good ideas from them. Jane's offered up a couple of good contacts within the state, including herself, to kind of help with some wetlands conversations. So we'll be reconvening, I think on Tuesday of next week. I'm happy to invite Jane into that and continue to work on our Google Docs for more refined strategies as we move forward.
All right. You know, at some point we should, as a group, think about how we bring the work of the task groups back to this larger group in a kind of structured way as we pull together our suite of recommendations. So I think that's a planning conversation for another day, but I encourage you all to kind of think about what would be a preferred process there as we begin to pull things together from these somewhat disparate groups into a comprehensive package. Let's see. So now we are in the David Mears honorable big ideas part of our meeting. So this is just a little bit of unstructured time for folks to kind of raise questions, ideas, dig into certain policies or problems that are relevant to the group. We could pick up on the conversation we were having earlier. So no expectations here. If we don't need the time, we don't need to use it, but just some space for us to kind of talk about more meatier topics as anyone sees fit. What you got, David?
Since you named it after me, maybe I'll just with two topics that I would love to hear other people's perspectives, because I assume others are wrestling with this too. But the two topics are, first, the tension on the one hand of trying to get down to talking about specific concrete actions on the ground that we want to drive through a variety of policies. Trying to get to that place, which is in some ways really necessary in order for us to make estimates about, what are the costs and what are the greenhouse gas emission benefits or what are the resilience benefits. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, wanting to think about the tools. What are the policy tools that we use? Is it public funding? Is it regulatory? Is it a set of technical assistance and outreach? And I'm finding there for myself that I find it really helpful to focus on the concrete, on the ground actions. And I'll give a quick example though of where I've gotten hung up, because one of the issues that's come up in the ag task group has been, should we be pushing towards an idea like, an infrastructure idea like putting caps on manure lagoons to capture all the methane, and whether flare it off or drive its use, for energy purposes, which would be ideal. But there's some technical questions about really what are the net benefits of that and costs and so forth, and we haven't gone into it. But it's also generated this other conversation because at least I'm, for my part, feeling uncomfortable with the idea of thinking like, wow, I don't know that I want to invest more public money in infrastructure for the larger dairy farms, so the ones who most benefit from that. As much as I would love to see them take that action, I'm not sure that's the right investment of public money. And I'm not saying it isn't, I'm just saying I have a question about it. And, but then I realized we didn't necessarily have to decide that. Like, let's figure out the policy of how we would drive it, because we could use regulatory, we could use technical assistance, or we might use funding. We don't necessarily have to jump straight to the only way to get there is funding. So that's my own personal journey. I welcome other reflections. And then the second category is, maybe I shouldn't go into it in any detail, but we've all been wrestling with the issue of at what point do you run the ideas that we're kicking around, these on the ground practical ideas, through a lens of equity, diversity, inclusion. And should we how early on do you do that? Because there's a fear that if we don't do it early enough, that we, Alyssa really articulated this well yesterday. If we don't do it early enough, then it gets kind of pushed to the back burner and we don't kind of ever really address it. On the other hand, I'm finding myself at a practical level struggling a little bit to think about like, well, as I compare, I don't know, cover crops versus, flaring methane, like, I'm not sure. It's just my brain is struggling a little bit to think about how would I build equity. And at that point, I think the equity issues may come in a different way and a different layer. And I'm just struggling to figure out how to do it early enough so that it remains essential consideration, but that we also don't get hung up in the ether thinking about it in a theoretical context. So I'll shut up there. I know I threw a lot out.
I guess those are great questions. And I guess to your first, at least personally, I've been approaching it as like, let's get all the ideas out there and then see how they could be implemented. And, it could be through different channels. It could be regulatory, they could be incentive-based, they could be technical assistance, they could be a mix. But that, at least for me, is kind of like a second order question. And I think probably one that, this would be something we should get some input from Jane around, but like who's making those calls, right? Is it the subcommittees recommending like, this is something that we should tax and spend for, this is something that should be borne by the users, or is that direction that we should be getting from the council? And I just don't know the answer to that personally.
I think that's going to start at the subcommittees, but ultimately there's going to have to be a prioritization of funding and cost packages at the council level, I would suspect.
I'm just going to jump in. Yesterday there was a meeting of the Soil Health Policy Network, and Alyssa and Lauren and Ryan and maybe others were there, but Lauren said, we're going to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. And I think, Billy seemed to say the same thing roughly just now. And I think that's good. One of my worries is we are a small state out of 50 states, all of whom are hopefully doing something about this problem to some degree or other. We can all have opinions about what some states might do compared to others, but all of that is going to impact us because that's the nature of the beast. We are on one piece of land, and I worry about us getting, if we make certain decisions, getting swamped or rolled over by actions taken by another state, which might be detrimental to what we want to do. And that's, there's nothing we can do about that. It's just a worry or a concern I have. If anybody can think about how we can deal about that, I would love to hear it. But, I'm sure there will be things that we will think are really good climate emission controls, which may have a real detrimental effect on a specific part of agriculture. And I agree with David that we shouldn't, we shouldn't just blindly invest more and more money in certain branches of ag. There are things that we do now that we may need to reassess and decide if it may, it may have been good in the past. For example, there was a federal program to smother us in superphosphate back in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, and that turned out to be a really bad idea. So, we can reassess some of our ag policies and see if they can be better and have more of the long-term view that Abby is talking about.
Judy has her hand up, and Alyssa. So Judy, let's go to you and then to Alyssa.
I'm not sure I understood what David said about where equity should be discussed or if it should be held to the end. But my thoughts are that equity should be addressed at every issue that's brought to the forefront, every issue. I can give you an example of a compost facility who had a choice of digging leachate ponds or pumping the leachate away to some other place. And they chose to dig the ponds without any permitting to hold 1 million gallons of leachate right over the top of known burial sites. And so then they decided, well, we're going to plant ground cover over that area. And so they planted specific plants that needed to be rototilled in every so many months. And again, it was over a known burial site. So I think no matter what the issue is, equity has to be considered at every phase. You can't wait to the end and think of it as an afterthought.
Great, thanks. And to your point, Judy, I missed the just transition update when we were going around with the task groups, and Iris provided an update in the chat. And I think we're going to have some time next week for her and others to help work with us to make sure that we are integrating that consideration, early and regularly throughout the process of developing our recommendations. So thanks for that. Okay, maybe 2 weeks, says Jane. Alyssa, you're next, and then Lauren, your hand's up after hers.
Great, thanks, Billy. I just wanted to appreciate your reminder that our job is to put everything up against the wall, and share all the ideas, even the ones that don't fit into this really short-term pressure to reduce emissions by 2025. And I have just noticed that increasingly the tensions and between these many different goals and outcomes that we need to meet as a group are coming up already. And I hope that we capture and continue to reflect those things in our recommendations so that they are also considered by folks later on, and that we don't just leave those discussions here, but share all of that. Especially, just thinking about this conversation we had yesterday about investing in big technological fixes like anaerobic digesters and manure caps. And I think when we hear again today that these immediate decisions about meeting the 2025 reductions will be at the forefront of the report and decision making in the near term. It makes those things that those big technological fixes that could have a big impact on emissions reductions clearly seem to float to the top. And I just want to make sure that we continue to preserve the other considerations about long-term vision and equity and adaptation and resilience that can get lost. And so I just wanted to appreciate you, Billy, for bringing that up, that we should continue to put all the information out there. And although we can discuss it here at the committee level, I don't want to leave things out when we share our process later.
Sounds good, thank you. Lauren.
Well, unsurprisingly, I'll just agree with everything Alyssa just said. And on that, and David, I'm not sure how your unstructured big ideas placeholder is supposed to go, so I'll just throw another one out there. I sent an email to the Science and Data Subcommittee co-chairs yesterday, just flagging this issue, but it seems to be especially of import for all of us in our respective task conversations too, is the demographic challenge that Vermont presents to us and the anticipated significant land transfer that's coming in the next decade or two, and the implications that that's going to have on developmental pressures, land use changes, and just keeping our eye on that, and not sure how we can plug that potentially into the work that the contractors and consultants might do and our science and data. But for us, really high level, that is something that I think each of our task groups should be discussing and formulating strategies around, or at least in consideration with it.
I'll just jump in and say, good point, Lauren. And there has been some work done on kind of strategies to facilitate the intergenerational transfer of working forest land. And I can drop a link of that into the chat for folks who are interested. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, response to anything folks have raised? Yeah, I think, and Jane, feel free to kind of kick me under the desk, but I do think to just the broader conversation, the opportunity to address the broad suite of resilience and adaptation issues is really kind of up to us to manage, right? If we can get things to a place where we feel like they've been thoroughly vetted publicly and screened for equity and have sufficient public process, given how heavy or impactful the recommendations are, then we certainly can bring them forward, at this time. And the things that we can't get all the way through and vet with impacted peoples and communities adequately by this fall, then we can certainly keep them on a list that hopefully is included in the action plan of things where continued work is necessary. So I think that's always how I've envisioned this. It's not we're precluding anything. It's more just a race to see what we can get sufficiently fleshed out by that deadline, with the expectation and understanding that we're going to keep working on everything else. Okay, any other thoughts, comments, discussion? All right, so Jane made a perfect segue to our next item in the chat. Our next item is to talk about our next meeting. And she said we should talk about the timeline next week in more detail so we can all plan accordingly. So originally I thought maybe we would have Just Transitions in next Friday to speak about their principles, but it sounds like maybe that's 2 weeks out. So any thoughts or suggestions on how we want to use our time next week? I think we'll have about, an hour or so of unstructured time. The time that we used with climate access and RISE today, we could, use again for any number of topics. So I think schedule and timeline is certainly one that sounds like a good idea to me, but if others have thoughts or suggestions, please say them or put them in the chat. Okay. Crickets. Abby, you have anything you want to think we should focus on next week? We can also, you and I can give this some more thought and come back with a full agenda later in the week, but just want to give you a chance to weigh in now if you have any thoughts.
No, I don't at the moment. I'm feeling like there's definitely value in allowing for some of these bigger, the idea brains, David's, however you titled it earlier. I think sometimes that allows things to surface that might not otherwise, which is helpful. I'm not sure if everybody else agrees, but I think it's a good space to have on the agenda. But otherwise, I think to Jane's point, we are going to need some in-depth detailed talk about sort of, I think earlier she brought up, process documents and templates and things like that. Some of the logistical pieces of how we bring the work from the task groups forward into the subcommittee.
Sounds good. Any other thoughts? Okay, seeing none. Right, so Jane did just put into the chat, we did get some outreach from some of the biologists in our Fish and Wildlife Department interested in sharing a tool that they've developed around ecological adaptation and regional connectivity called Vermont Conservation Design. And it kind of works with and bounces off work the Nature Conservancy has done around ecological resiliency as well. So, that is probably particularly relevant to certain task groups, but it may resonate for the whole group. So, Abby, Jane, and I can think about whether there's time next week for that conversation, or if folks are agreeable, we can bring those folks in at a future date, because it's a really interesting work. All right, well, with that, I believe we are at our second public comment opportunity, a little early. So do any members of the public care to share your thoughts or comments or questions with subcommittee right now? If so, please raise your hands or make yourself known otherwise.
Hi, Billy. Zach Porter again. I do have one question for the subcommittee.
Sure. Let's see. Well, we've got Gordon, Graham, and Zach. So let's just see if there's anyone else. Okay, so let's Zach, why don't you go ahead, and then we can go with Gordon and then Graham.
Thanks. Okay, I'll be quick. This is Zach Porter again with Conservation Law Foundation. My question was, and I meant to ask this earlier, if members of the public want to suggest specific names of stakeholders whom we'd like to see added to that list, to the spreadsheet that was talked about earlier for outreach, how would members of the public do that? Thanks.
Yeah, that is a good question. I don't know, Jane, if you could speak to that.
So they can send them directly to me and I can manage that forward. But the other obvious answer would be to also use the public input form. And I have been making space now to read those comments to ensure that I forward on anything that's timely. So the public input form is on the Vermont Climate Council website. You can use that. It also has a generic mailbox for the Climate Council. I can drop that email address in the chat for folks to send them to.
Great, thank you. Anything else from you at this time, Zach?
Nope, thanks, Jane. And thanks, Billy.
Great, so Gordon, why don't you take the floor?
Everybody, thanks as always for having some really substantive and dynamic conversations going on, and really not letting any stone go unturned. But I just had a little bit of confusion about the engagement timeline, and just wanted to ask a clarifying question. Is there a specific deadline to get substantive comments to the working groups or the subcommittee to have input on that before it moves up to the Climate Council, or is that still kind of in the works system or timeline?
Jane, can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I don't think I quite understood the question. Sorry. Was it around comments on the public engagement plan, or this first phase of engagement?
I think the first phase of engagement, and that first round of developing policy proposals on the working group level that will then come to the subcommittee. Is there a way or a deadline to engage with those working groups and make some substantive policy either discussions or points? Yeah.
So for the task groups in particular of the subcommittee, so that they could hear your comments to inform what they present to this subcommittee as they round out the package. Well, the timeline that we're now on will be that complete package will be done in the end of June or first week of July. And so I imagine now is as good a time as any to start providing any feedback to task leads. And you can do that a couple ways, but I would also encourage the public input form if you don't know a direct contact for the task lead you're interested in. And when you use that public input form, use the drop down for ag and ecosystems that's specific to the group. And I can make it available then to the subcommittee co-chairs who can pass it on to the right task lead. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Okay, anything else from you, Gordon? Okay, Graham.
Thanks, everyone. My first is just a question, and I think it's for Jane. You mentioned that there's an expected sort of sequestration deliverable for this group from the carbon budget. And I was just trying to, so is that, were you saying that that has already been articulated, or that that is something that's being articulated and you're going to report back to this group on it?
Are you talking about what I dropped in the chat?
No, I think it was said earlier in the meeting. You mentioned something about a carbon budget and expected deliverable.
Yeah, I put that in the chat. So I think that's what you mean. But anyway, I made a comment in the chat that suggested that as we're bringing the technical analysis consultants on board, which maybe this is a good as any time to update everybody, because I don't think I did that with the subcommittee. The technical analysis proposals closed a week and a half, almost 2 weeks ago on a Monday. The review committee that comprised of counselors and A&R staff met this past Monday to review the 4 proposals that the agency received, all of which were excellent. Any of the consultants could have done the work. We considered the 5 components that were included in their proposals that we put out in the RFP, which consisted of one of those being the carbon budget. And in that conversation, I was just suggesting, as the consultants come on board, that we should start to have the task lead for the carbon budget convene that group so that we could consider start to consider the methodology and ensure that we're all on the same page of what that deliverable will look like from the consultants, so that we can inform their work early in the process. As the review of the greenhouse gas inventory and the carbon budget are the first 2 deliverables from the technical consultants, and they're actually supposed to be done by the end of June. So they'll be done quite quickly.
That's good to hear, Jane. So, as I think Ryan and I are the kind of co-leads of that task group, Alyssa and others are members of it. So I'm happy to work with you and kind of pulling that all together and moving it forward. So Graham, I think the short answer is we're hopefully going to have some clarity around the carbon budget earlier than later in the process, so that we can have some context for the work we're doing around sequestration and storage strategies.
Great, thank you. That's clarifying. Yeah, that's helpful. And the other comment was just, both the questions that David brought up, the one related to sort of how to spend money and how to think about appropriate places for spending money in relationship to, immediate payoff versus long-term resilience or adaptation, or maybe other goals outside of sequestration or greenhouse gas emissions. And the other was equity. And I think those questions also can go together in some respects. And I know that Ryan and Alyssa and other folks here are also involved in the PES, the Soil Health and PES Working Group. And currently there's sort of a review of existing programs happening there. And I think ideally where a place like that could, analysis like that could get us is a place in understanding not only like what practices are currently being spent, but what are the outcomes we're seeing from those practices, what types and scales of farms are being funded, and how much, which would also mean who is not being funded in terms of thinking about equitable distribution of funding, depending on what the sort of metrics of equity are that we're looking at. But it makes, when we talk about things like, David specifically mentioned digesters and manure caps, I think part of the question is also this greater context that Lauren brought up of sort of land parcelization, land moving out of ag, and what's this larger vision we have for the future. I think digesters and caps are often on medium to larger scale farms, and providing a significant amount of financial support to certain sectors, can support or not support particular trends in farming or in land parcelization, et cetera. So one of our goals is to make sure that we have more farmers able to access more land for smaller, more distributed operations and diverse operations over time. Those are goals certainly to consider, I think, as well with this. And I would certainly argue that those do tie into climate goals directly and indirectly as well. So I think that's, largely what I wanted to say. And I know I've spoken to in the past about thinking about mitigation versus adaptation and transformation. And I think these, again, when you're thinking about things like digesters and caps, we're talking about lessening the impacts of operations that are making particular impacts. And again, how can we also support operations that are not making impacts is a really important question. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be funding manure caps or potentially digesters. It's more saying that we need to think about funding mitigation, adaptation, and transformation. And how does that fit into your picture as a climate council, the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, in relationship to both your 5-year goals, but also longer term goals? I think, from the international community, in particular, the organizations that Rural Vermont works with, the U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, Levy and Campesina, National Family Farm Coalition, as I said before, there's a lot of clear statements and research coming across, just pointing to the need to recognize this idea of net zero as not necessarily true. There's not a net zero. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we need to get to the place we want to, but we can't achieve our goals only by mitigating existing problems and not actually reducing the emissions as we need to. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to, we're working on developing some written comments for you all as well. So I hope to get those to you in a couple of weeks. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Graham. Any other members of the public care to comment at this time? All right, anyone else from the subcommittee or staff want to share anything before we break? Cool. All right, well, thanks everyone. Get some lunch, get out there, enjoy the sunshine, have a good weekend, and Abby and I will be back at you with an agenda sometime later next week.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.